Welcome everyone to the Farmer's Landscape of Rural America. This is the second of our Week 4 lectures, and we'll be looking at the experiences of America's farmers in the second half of the 19th century. And we start with an ode to the American farmer from one of America's principal architects of liberty, Thomas Jefferson, writing in the Notes on the State of Virginia, a publication that he penned in the 1780s, just after the American Revolution. Jefferson said, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. It is the focus in which he keeps alive that sacred fire, which otherwise might escape from the face of the earth." And so it seemed that for the first 200 years of American history, there was no figure more venerated, more celebrated, more respected than the American farmer. As this 19th century lithograph shows, the farmer proudly occupied the center of America's portrait of occupations. Another look here at a similar poster. You see the proud claim of the American farmer, "I feed you all." And he is shown along with other various occupations, that of the minister, that of the soldier, that of the shipper, the apothecary and dry goods merchants. A variety of occupations, even that of the businessman here. But at the center of them all was the American farmer, who could claim proudly, "I feed you all." Now, I think there's some fairly straightforward reasons for the celebration of the American farmer. The original boast of America to the world was that it was the best poor man's country, and it was so because, unlike the old world nations, the New World, America, offered even the poor servant, even the poor laborer, an opportunity to begin life anew as a landowner, as a subsistence farmer. And the government always, that is the government of the United States, always encouraged this view, going so far as to subsidize the giveaway of untold acreage of American land. In the Homestead Act of 1862, the government promised 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to move to the Trans-Mississippi West, the great central plains of America, to build a house, dig a well, plow just 10 acres, and the land would be yours, essentially for free. As the poster suggested, millions of acres were opened up now to anyone essentially willing to follow the terms of the agreement and to begin farming as homesteading farmers, the great central plains of the North American continent. So the federal government, with its Homestead Act, supported and subsidized the expansion of the farmer frontier across the continent. It's hard to overstate the importance or sort of singular significance of the Homestead Act, because really never in history had an organized governmental force simply given away such vast acreage to poor farming folk. The situation was almost always the reverse in history, where the land of poor farming folk was enclosed or taken by governing powers. But in America, that was reversed. And Thomas Jefferson, who venerated the farmer, as we saw, had claimed that this represented America's empire of liberty. Jefferson had died, of course, a quarter century before the Homestead Act, but I think he had envisioned, for example, with the Louisiana Purchase that took place under his presidency, had envisioned what he called an empire of liberty. Normally that phrase would seem contradictory or oxymoronic. An empire is something that usually aggregates power and property and land, whereas liberty typically implies freedom from such an aggregation of power. And yet Jefferson spoke unembarrassed about an empire of liberty because, as he envisioned it, it would be the poor family farmer who would gain independence by following the farmer's frontier, by plowing 100 acres, 160 acres, what have you, raising a crop that would make him and his family independent and self-sufficient. And in this way, the political and legal and material aspirations of American democracy would be kept alive across a vast frontier. And so it seemed that Jefferson's vision was playing out over the course of the late 19th century. As you can see here, the population of rural America steadily increases from 28 million to more than 45 million in just 30 years. And so America was mostly a rural nation. In fact, it would not be until 1920 that the urban population of America would surpass the rural population of America. And thus it's really not an exaggeration to say that for most of the 19th century, America was a farmer's nation. And that most of American soil represented a farmer's frontier. The value of American agriculture increased over the course of the century as well. At the time of the Civil War, the total value of American farms counted out to about $14.6 billion, whereas by 1900, with the expansion of rural America, the total aggregate value of American farms was now counted out at $36 billion. And I think the value of American agriculture was tied not only to the fact that more land was being brought under cultivation, thanks to the Homestead Act and the expansion, territorial expansion of the United States, but also because in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, you had a great leap in agricultural technology. Humankind had been farming for many thousands of years prior to the 19th century. The Agricultural Revolution was almost 10,000 years old by that point. But something happens with the industrializing processes of the 19th century. Something happens to farming. It becomes modernized. It becomes technological. You see a picture here showing the McCormick harvester and twine binder. Cyrus McCormick had established his farm machinery factory in Virginia, and in 1881, McCormick produced the first automated or mechanical harvester and twine binder, which did the work of not only baling and binding the cut hay, for example, but did so mechanically, replacing countless man-hour investment and labor. So yeah, agriculture was making a great leap forward in the age of industry. And no wonder that farmers were proud of their accomplishments individually and as a class of Americans. At the heart of the American national identity, farmer pride and identity was preserved in a new nationwide movement in 1867 known as the Patrons of Husbandry organization, known most often by its nickname, the Grange. And the Grange was a farmer-led organization, a voluntary association of farmers that by 1875 could claim 20,000 chapters, individual local chapters, and more than 1 million members across the vast American landscape. Now the Grangers were, as I say, a voluntary association of farmers who gathered together to celebrate their common interests, to find common connection, to overcome the isolation of rural life, to have social and cultural connection. This vast landscape of the central and northern plains often meant that farms were rather isolated. And it was a way to bring farmers together, to have a good time, to enjoy a picnic, to compare information about seeds and yields, crop yields, and all the variety of interests that had come to occupy the thoughts of farmers in this modern age. They were called the Grange because the name Grange came from a shorthand term meaning a place where one's grain was stored. There are still, in our own time in America, still Grange halls left standing that are a testament to the popularity of the Granger movement. Sometimes I have my students snap a photo and bring it in if they see something that we've been discussing, seen something nearby. And in Fair Oaks in the Sacramento area, one of my students took a picture here of the Fair Oaks Grange Hall. And these were simple but rather elegant little buildings, usually white buildings, faced with windows and sort of symmetrical windows and doors and simple frame structures, often painted white. And in the Grange halls, you could have farmers' meetings, but you could also have picnics and barbecues and dances and all kinds of get-togethers. There's another one just outside of Sacramento near Nevada City in a little town called Rough and Ready, another Grange hall. So the landscape was dotted with Grange halls, and it was a familiar sight in small towns and local communities. Well, what seemed to be a promising beginning for the farmers of the 19th century took a very interesting turn in the last quarter of the 19th century. And looking ahead just a bit, we see this famous photograph from the 1896 Democratic Party National Convention, Presidential Nominating Convention, and a famous American, a famous farmer figure of the age, a politician by the name of William Jennings Bryan, in the throes of a great oratorical performance here in which he thunders famously, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Well, what was he talking about, and why does he seem so angry? If things are going well for farmers, why is he invoking the image of a crucifixion? Well, in order to understand that, we need to follow the string of events over the last quarter century. Yes, it's true American agriculture was more productive and more valuable than ever before, but that did not mean that the standing of the individual family farmer was necessarily as secure as it had once been. Given the enormous growth of the marketplace and the unpredictability of that marketplace, it seems that millions of family farmers spread across the country were now facing something that they had not reckoned with, and that was a loss of independence and a loss of autonomy in the face of the powerful market forces that were now coming to govern the country. And keep in mind, it was independence and autonomy that made the farmers, in Jefferson's word, the chosen people of God. That is, their self-sufficiency, their subsistence, their independence is what made them the backbone of a democratic political system that relied upon civic participation and the basic independence of the popular sovereign, that is, of the people. Now, what was undermining this? Well, in the eyes of farmers, there were corporate entities like the railroads that were beginning to take over much of the business of the transporting of agricultural produce to the great market centers like Chicago. Railroads would determine the shipping schedules and prices by which farmers would send their grain, for example, or their corn, or their beef, or their produce. The farmers began accusing the railroads of what they considered to be an unfair favoritism and even discrimination in the applying of schedules and prices. The basic complaint was that some farmers were being charged more, considerably more than other farmers to ship their goods, or that they were given more flexible scheduling in some cases than other farmers. farmers suffering from inconvenient shipping times and schedules. And there was some truth to this. The railroads tended to reward the larger producers, and those whose farms were closer to the main trunk lines of the railroads. If you operated a smaller farm relatively farther away from the main lines of the railroad, chances are you are going to pay extra and have less flexible scheduling to take advantage of what the railroads could do in shipping your produce. The railroads were owned usually as corporate entities by wealthy Easterners, or at least big city corporate interests, and so they seemed far removed from the concerns and needs of the more rural, often isolated farming population. And in a similar way, farmers came to resent banking interests, large corporate banking interests, in particular state banking interests that seemed to want to gouge the farmers. You know, farmers like other Americans in the 19th century were becoming more dependent on credit, extended credit from banking institutions. Not only did one require credit to purchase expensive new high-tech farm equipment, but often to purchase additional acreage as well. And even in a more personal sense, as retail catalog chains like Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward's began appealing to rural folk to buy consumer goods in the late 1800s. It was often the case that extending consumer credit meant that farmers would become now indebted in those ways as well. So in debt to the banks, in myriad ways, farmers complained about being charged exorbitant interest rates. And again, there's some truth to this. Economic historians have documented that it's more than a little true that farmers were often charged excessively high interest rates in comparison to other customers. Now, the banks justified this, as banks typically will do, based on the amount of risk that such lending of credit involves. Farmers, from the perspective of banks, operated in an inherently risky environment. They depended on a full crop, full market price to gain their revenues, but often one or both of those conditions failed. If there were climate problems, weather problems, too much rain, too little rain, an early frost, then crops might fail. If the international crop market was oversupplied, then prices might drop. And so in various ways, farmers might end up on the short end of the revenue scale. And knowing this, bankers often charge them more interest for the money that they borrow. Now, of course, in the eyes of farmers, this was all balderdash. You can imagine it from the perspective of the farmer being told that you were a risk, when in fact the country had always celebrated you as the very backbone of its national identity. That wasn't going to jibe. There was also anger among farmers with banks for fueling speculative purchases of land, that is, encouraging land investors to gobble up available acreage that otherwise could be used for farming, not in order to cultivate the soil, but to hold on to it as an investment opportunity until prices would rise and then selling it off. But that meant that farmers themselves would often be faced with having to purchase land at what they considered to be inflated prices. And finally, another major grievance of the farmers by the last quarter of the 19th century concerned the nation's monetary system, which at that time was based on a gold standard. And this was a standard championed by bankers who believed that a nation's currency should not exceed a certain percentage of its gold holdings. Gold being a precious metal and almost universally recognized as intrinsically valuable, represented the backbone, if you will, of the monetary system. to produce currency or money beyond the supply of gold in the minds of bankers was foolhardy and inflationary. I remember thinking as a little kid, why can't we just cure poverty by printing more money, more dollars, and giving them away to poor people? But of course, as an economist would explain it, that paper money is only a kind of symbol, really, of something inherently valuable. It is a medium of exchange that merely represents the value of some other commodity like gold that in and of itself is valuable. And that if you produce too much paper money, in effect you render it essentially worthless, or at least not worth more than the paper it's printed on, as the saying goes, as it outstrips the actual value of something like a gold supply. Well, that was the argument for keeping the country on a gold supply, which was a kind of restrictive and conservative monetary policy that would ensure that, among other things, the central control over the nation's money would remain in the hands of banks. But farmers didn't like that. They didn't trust banks for reasons we've already suggested. They were corporate entities, often seen as being dominated by far removed and urban corporate interests. And farmers wanted something else. They wanted a more flexible currency. And we'll talk more about that idea of flexible currency. But given all this hostility and resentment that begins to build rather quickly after the Civil War in the last quarter or so of the 19th century, it manifests itself in the popular culture in some interesting ways. The rise of what we might call the outlaw hero in America and in American popular culture. Characters such as the notorious train robber Jesse James became symbols for the growing frustration with corporate influence over rural lives, especially the influence of corporate bankers and other so-called robber baron or railroad tycoons. And even though James was a criminal in the eyes of the law, he was a kind of outlaw hero in the eyes of many rural people because he at least was depicted in popular terms as a Robin Hood figure, someone who would attack the corporate interests by robbing trains and stealing the money in bank vaults and that sort of thing. So a kind of interesting cultural response by farmers in cultivating the outlaw hero character. In more serious ways, farmers are attempting to fight the effects of the capitalist marketplace by combining together their interests. In the late 19th century, you see this effort not only among farmers but among urban working people as well to form, working men's groups and labor unions and such. For the farmers, it was the so-called farmers' alliances that they hoped would help protect them from the ravaging effects of the marketplace. Farmers coming together to form cooperatives, for example, pooling their money to buy supplies in bulk at lower discount rates, combining together to sell their produce in ways that would enhance their revenue, holding on to grain, for example, keeping it off the market in times of surplus, storing it in grain storage sites or grain elevators. In fact, going so far as to purchase their own grain elevators. Here's a modern picture of a grain elevator been established around 1910 in Paso Robles, California by the local almond growers association. So whether it was almonds or wheat grains or corn or what have you, farmers joining together, pooling their money, investing in silos, investing in storage sites and grain elevators and such, and thus hoping to gain some kind of leverage over a marketplace that otherwise they felt, had no particular interest of theirs at heart. Getting back to the money issue for a second, under the gold standard, as I mentioned earlier, farmers felt that they were being unfairly squeezed by a deflationary money standard. And they blame this on the banking monopolies and the railroading monopolies There's some truth to the idea that it was the business interests, the financial interests, that lobbied most diligently to keep the gold standard, because in just basic macroeconomic terms, if you have a lender creditor establishment, such as banks represent, who are in the business of lending money, establishing or providing credit to borrowers, it's in the interest of that establishment to keep the money supply deflationary or deflated. And what that means is that the actual value of the money that your borrowers have to pay you back, at interest of course, but to pay you back, that the actual real value of that money will be more closely tied to the real value of something like the gold standard, so that they're paying you back in money, not gold. Most borrowers can't afford to pay back their loans in gold, but the money that they do give would be as closely indexed to the value of gold as possible in a deflationary monetary system. But farmers wanted an inflationary system. They wanted more money. They wanted what they call the people's money in particular, or a bimetallic standard. Instead of having only gold, they would combine with gold, now silver, in the form of silver coinage. And the free coinage of silver became a rallying cry for many groups, including farmers groups in the late 19th century. Silver was the people's money simply because, though it was a bit less valuable than gold, it was far more abundant, especially after the Motherlode strikes up in Virginia City and elsewhere increased the nation's silver supply. And the way farmers saw it, if people had more money, silver coins and such, that would have an inflationary effect. And in fact, it is to the advantage of borrowers to pay back their loans, to meet their credit obligations with inflated currency. Lenders hate it, but borrowers love it because it's a more plentiful currency. It's easier to acquire what you need to pay back. And we see here a bit of sheet music to a song sponsored by the Massachusetts Democratic Club, Free Silver and Bryan, in 1900. And there's William Jennings Bryan again, who we'll come back to. This really captures the imagination of the country, this whole brewing conflict between farmers and laborers on the one hand, and creditors and lenders and railroaders and bankers and others on the other. It's sort of a rural versus urban, common people versus wealthy interests kind of a contest. And so it captures the imagination of the public. And I guess most of you have heard of the Wizard of Oz stories, or the motion picture by the same name from 1939. And if you've ever seen the movie, or maybe even read some of the original stories by the Midwestern journalist and author L. Frank Baum, whose Wizard of Oz stories eventually were turned into the famous motion picture, then maybe without even realizing it, you were tapping into a kind of allegory of American life and culture in the late 19th century. And the familiar characters from Dorothy, the Kansas farm girl, to her cohorts, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, and even the little dog Toto, they all represent, in allegorical terms, interests, political and laboring interests of the late 19th century. First of all, the story is grounded in the depressed economy of the farmers' frontier of Kansas, where a tornado seemingly destroys Dorothy's home and sends her on a almost surreal journey to find that home again along the famous yellow brick road. Well, everything from the yellow brick, which represented the gold standard, to the name of the city itself, Oz here. As you know, OZ is the abbreviation for ounce, and gold is measured in ounces. And Oz was a great city with a great wizard who it was said would help Dorothy, but he reneges and doesn't help her, and thus symbolically at least represented the corporate interests of America not helping the farmers The Scarecrow, her boon companion, was brainless in the story, a fit symbol in Baum's world for the farmer who seemed not to know his interests. Even the Tin Man representing the laboring population of the cities, the factory workers of the city. I mean, on and on it goes. Originally, Dorothy's shoes in the movie are ruby red slippers, but in the original stories they were silver, representing again the farmer's interests. It's silver. The great and malevolent witches, the wicked witches of the East and West, representing some think the railroads, the interests of the railroad. So, yeah, the Wizard of Oz, a kind of a parable or allegorical tale of America in the late 19th century. Perhaps in a more serious way was the rise of a new political movement. Farmers, invested as they were in what they saw as the democratic promise of the farmer's landscape, the ability to own your own land, to maintain your own independence, led them naturally to the political process to defend their interests, and the rise of what historians call populism in the late 19th century. And populism, on the one hand, is just a generic term that refers to any sort of broad-based popular political movement, usually one that takes place outside the two formal parties, the Democratic and Republican Party. In fact, usually populist movements originate out of a growing wave of discontent with the two main parties. In our own time, of course, the Tea Party movement has taken on the trappings of a populist movement. And in the 19th century, it was the farmers who began organizing grassroots associations and political clubs and giving speeches and whipping up support. One of the great orators of the populist movement was a Kansas farm wife by the name of Mary Lease, who began traveling throughout the farmer states of the Midwest and giving speeches, fiery speeches, because populism is often associated with a kind of rising tide of indignation and a groundswell of righteous, righteous support. And Mary Lease was a real fire-breathing orator. You can just see by some of the excerpts here. In an 1892 speech, she thundered, "Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people." Here she's paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln from the Gettysburg Address. But a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. Kansas farmer's wife though she was also a law school graduate, and unusual for that day for a female to have graduated from a law school. So she was a sophisticated and articulate defender of the farmer interests, but a firebrand. The great common people of the country are slaves, she said, and monopoly is the master. And that's very common in American populism, a kind of us versus them, where the them is some moneyed elite or some aristocratic elite that has somehow managed to take the democratic powers and somehow monopolize them. "Money rules," she said. "The parties lie to us and the political speakers mislead us." So thoroughly disenchanted is she and other populists with what they see as the corruption now of the political system. So they form their own political party called the People's Party, and begin running candidates for office and do well, particularly, not surprisingly, in the farmer states. In 1890, the People's Party wins control of the Kansas and Nebraska legislatures, heavily, supported by the votes of farmers. And 8 other legislatures, they managed to capture a majority of the seats. An extraordinary accomplishment for a brand new party to win control of 10 different state legislatures. Not surprisingly, they began looking to the presidential contest, first in 1892, where a populist candidate of the People's Party is run against the Democrat or Republican candidates, and though he doesn't win, wins 9% of the popular vote, which was a respectable total. And in that year, 1892, the People's Party platform was established basically to give voice to what it is that the farmers wanted. And it combines some of the kind of fire-breathing rhetoric that we saw with Mary Lease from the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, read the platform. We breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires. Tramps and millionaires. This was no longer a democracy. There was no longer a pretense to the idea that all Americans were somehow, broadly speaking, equal. Because now, according to the People's Party, this country had been stratified into two great classes. One small in number, that of millionaires, and the other teeming and poor, the so-called tramps, but really the common people. And so this again was a fiery retort that put forward an image of American virtue being lost in the pocketbooks and in the wallets of the fat cats, the bankers, the railroaders, the monopolists. This Thomas Nast cartoon you might recognize, the signature style of Thomas Nast, simply showed the fat cat, plutocrat as they were called. Among other things, you get a lot of great names, nicknames, and insulting kinds of terms for the rich, and plutocrat was one of the most popular. And instead of a human head, this plutocrat has a money bag. The Omaha platform continued. The conditions which surround us best justify our cooperation. We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench, meaning the judiciary. The fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen up to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind. And here they are again, almost invariably shown as fat, corpulent, cigar-smoking, self-satisfied, and smug, the monopolists. Ignatius Donnelly, the author of the Omaha Platform, writes, "We seek to restore the government of the Republic to the hands of the plain people with which class it originated." So a classic of populist rhetoric, the idea that the people are taking the country back. Maybe it sounds familiar to you. The actual articles of the Omaha Platform are quite interesting. On the one hand, they combine the sort of fiery rhetoric we've seen. Wealth belongs to the producing classes. The land should not be monopolized for speculative purpose. The people must own and control the means of transportation and communication. A charge that would today, just as it did then, elicit from its critics that this was socialism. But the populists believed that critical national industries like railroads, telephones, and telegraphs were too important to the general interests of society to be owned by the privileged few. The nation needs a graduated income tax. Ironically, that was a populist claim in 1892, but it, in our own day, is a object of scorn by the populist Tea Party, who says that the graduated income tax is somehow un-American. That's not how they felt in 1892. Banking corporations should be abolished. Silver should be freely coined. The people should govern through initiative, referendum, recall, and the Australian or secret ballot. And finally, the people should elect senators directly. Some of you who follow politics and know a bit about American political history will know that in fact, some of these platform items came to pass. While it's true that banking corporations were never abolished, silver coinage did make its way into the money supply. What he calls here initiative, referendum, recall, and the secret ballot did as well. Residents of California are familiar with the ballot propositions that form a part of every election. That's a reform that was instituted in this period to allow people to bypass their legislatures and vote directly. And same is true of the election of U.S. senators, which up to the late 19th century was undertaken by legislators. Legislators voted on who the senators would be, but now, as you must realize, the people themselves vote for senators. So I guess my point is that even though that the populists won't win the presidential elections, they are able to put forward certain reforms that will prove to be popular and taken up in the larger political system. Now back to William Jennings Bryan. In 1896, Bryan was to be the leading candidate of the People's Party, a second attempt now to win the presidency. Bryan was a Midwestern journalist, newspaperman, a fiery orator, and champion of the farmers' cause. But what happened in 1896 is that he was recruited away from the People's Party by one of the two mainstream parties, the Democratic Party, and convinced that by running as a Democrat, he would have a real chance of winning, whereas if he ran simply as the People's Party candidate, he would have at most a symbolic victory. And William Jennings Bryan accepted the offer and became the nominee of the Democratic Party. And it was during the Democratic Party National Convention of 1896, as I said before, that he gave a famous and fiery speech. And in that speech, he said, You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. So a rousing defense of the importance of farmers and a farmer's landscape to the health and well-being of the American nation. This proved to be a historic election, one that saw William Jennings Bryan lose to the Republican candidate, William McKinley. And it was historic for a number of reasons, partly because it once again showed how the two-party system could absorb a third party or populist movement or populist candidate like Bryan. And it was also historic because of Bryan's defeat. The great effort to, at sort of the crossroads of the industrial era, to somehow stem the tide of the industrial capitalist establishment, essentially failed because of Bryan's defeat. And his failure was memorialized by the American populist poet Vachel Lindsay. And I'm actually posting or giving you a link to the entire text of Lindsay's populist poem, epic poem called Bryan, Bryan, Bryan. And it captures the sort of poignancy of a people who'd invested in a man they thought would be their popular champion, Bryan, only to see him defeated. And there's a lot of anger at Bryan, by the way, by farmers who thought he had sold out by taking up the Democratic nomination. For many farmers believed that the Democratic Party was no better than the Republican Party, in that it was also dominated by moneyed interests. In fact, in The Wizard of Oz, we were talking about it a minute ago, the character of the Cowardly Lion has often been thought to have been based on William Jennings Bryan, a cowardly lion who sold out to the Democratic Party. And in Vachel Lindsay's poem, the poet intones, Election night at midnight, Boy Bryan's defeat. Defeat of Western silver, defeat of the wheat. Where is that boy, that heaven-born Bryan? So a lament here for what seemed to be the great crash of the populist hero. As I say, I'm putting a quick link up on our D2L site. You can read the whole text. It's really a fantastic sort of epic poem. But the defeat of Bryan mirrored the defeat of farmer politics. As you see the map here of the blue states representing Bryan's share, the red states representing McKinley's share, and then the as yet unorganized territories of Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Well, it was a fairly close election. McKinley wins 271 to 176 in terms of electoral votes, which counted as 7.1 million to 6.5 million of popular votes. And just a one vote victory, or excuse me, one state victory, 23 states to 22 states. So quite close. But you can tell a lot by looking at the colors on the map. Clearly, where does it seem Bryan's support came from? Well, from the great middle part of the country, and even the southern agricultural states. So the middle and southern agricultural belt went heavily for Bryan, but the great eastern states, the urban states of the industrial belt now, from New York to Pennsylvania to Illinois, and then the far west, also going for McKinley. And in a lot of ways, this election proves historic because, the image of the farmer is never really quite restored. There is a sense of defeatism associated in the popular culture now with farmers, where once Jefferson himself had proclaimed them to be the chosen people of God, and the great lithographs had showed the farmer proudly at the center. In the 20th century, the farmer's image in the popular culture will be more like that of the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz, kind of backwards, representative of what are supposed to be now outmoded rural values compared to the more progressive values of the cities. In a country whose urban population is growing, the farmer just seems somehow out of step with the times, too backwards looking, too unsophisticated. This wasn't by no means a fair assessment, but it does seem to take root. Whereas once the rural heartland represented a heartland, a kind of moral heartland of America, now it seems it's associated with a kind of narrow, rigid, outmoded thinking. Farmers weren't heroes anymore. They were hicks. They were backwards. Although the farmers themselves never give up, of course. By the 1930s, during the Great Depression, you had a new generation of troubadours like Woody Guthrie, sort of like Vachel Lindsay of an earlier period, kept hard at work espousing the virtues of America's farmers. His great song, Pastures of Plenty, which you can listen to on iTunes, composed in the 1930s during the worst of the Great Depression, was a kind of rousing anthem in support of the farmers. He says over here in this stanza that I make all your crops, and it's north up to Oregon to gather your hops, dig the beets from your ground, cut the grapes from your vine, to set on your table your light sparkling wine. And the your there is now the urban and suburban middle class that relies on the farmer's produce. He says at the end, I'll work till I die, my land I'll defend with my life if it be, 'cause my pastures of plenty must always be free. So, a new contest for a new age of America, rural versus urban, farmer versus city folk. What had once been universally regarded as the very heart of America's democratic promise was by the 20th century, in effect, the farmer, that is, fighting for his place at the American table. And ironically, it was the farmer who supplied that table. Farming was no less important. Food was no less important to daily human existence. But the place of the family farmer in that much larger marketplace of agricultural production seemed to considerably erode as the modern age unfolded. All right, that's enough now on the farmers. You can check out the quick link to the Vachel Lindsay poem if you want. I'm going to go ahead and post this online, and this material will be covered in the week 5 exam. So if you have questions about it, be sure that you let me know, and I will be happy to respond.